21 as we begin our study of God's Word, which, as we heard in, is part of the spiritual growth process. Worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. However, as important as it is, let's make sure it's not the only part of our spiritual wheel that we focus on, which sometimes we're guilty of, because we place so much emphasis on studying. And that is very, very important. But let's make sure we're not overlooking the other aspects of worship God and love one another and reaching the lost, especially reaching the lost. I say that's the one that I'm the worst at, and probably most Christians would say, well, that's the one I'm the worst at too. In the last class, Brian talked to us about the fact that Saul turned on David, and David had to get away. And Jonathan helped him to escape from Saul. And so we're going to see this pursuit just continue. And it's just really, really sad. Saul just, you think he went as low as he can go, and then he just keeps going lower. It gets more and more depraved as this story continues. So we're going to start here in 1 Samuel 21 and verses 1 through 9, where we learn about David and Ahimelech. Now, we're going to today talk about an Ahimelech and an Abimelech. Don't get those two confused. They're both very different men, okay? One is a king of the Philistines, a king of Gath of the Philistines, and one is a priest, okay? So Ahimelech is the priest. Abimelech is the king of Gath, right? So just don't get those two confused. This man is a descendant of whom? Ahimelech is a descendant of whom? All right, he's a descendant of Eli. All right, and just keep in mind, it seems like I just got louder. I'm going to talk a little quieter. I don't want to blow y'all out of the water here. We need to keep in mind the prophecy that was made concerning the descendants of Eli as we kind of move along and throughout this quarter. So just keep your eye on the descendants of Eli. And so we have Ahimelech here. Okay, let's read the first 3 verses of chapter 21. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" You know, David was a very prominent man. And for him to come to Nob and to be basically alone would be very alarming. David, verse 2, said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter, and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you, and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place.'" That's a lie. That's a total lie. Everything he just said was false. Okay. Verse 3, "Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found." Now let's go ahead and put Nob on the map so you can see where that's located. It's close to Gibeah. It's close to Jerusalem. So Ahimelech gives David the only bread that he has on hand, which is what? Showbread. Exactly. And if you remember a while back when we looked at a diagram of the tabernacle, the table of showbread was on the north wall of the tabernacle of the holy place, and it would look something like this. And so every day there would be 12 fresh loaves brought out for the priests. And so it wasn't to be eaten by anybody else. I mean, the law was very specific about this. But this is an extreme situation. It's an emergency. And so Ahimelech has a difficult decision to make. Do I observe the law, or do I, in this situation where there's another choice for something else that is good to do I give David bread? And so he gives David bread. Now there was a servant of Saul who was there. What was his name? Doeg. I just wanted to see if y'all said it like I do. So, Doeg. Probably not how the Hebrews said it. But Doeg, and what was his nationality? He was an Edomite. So he was not an Israelite. All right? But he's there, and he's observing, and David knows that he's there. David asks for a weapon, and he kind of makes up a reason why he needs a weapon. Well, the king's matter was urgent, and we didn't have time to grab a weapon, so I don't have a spear or a sword. And so what weapon is he given by Ahimelech? Y'all are going to have to mumble louder. I can't hear you. Goliath's sword, okay? And, oh, man, that must have been some sword. And David said, there's no sword like that one. I'll take that one. I'm not sure how the sword got there. I know that David kept Goliath's armor, but he did not keep his sword. And so he's very happy to have a weapon now. So that's just kind of neat to think as we move forward. It doesn't mention Goliath's sword again, at least to my memory. But what sword did he have with him? We know it was Goliath's sword. So just kind of keep that in mind. Jesus referenced this story in Matthew 12. And so why don't we turn there, please? And you might just keep this passage marked. I do want you to mark this passage because we're going to do a lot of flipping, actually, today. Matthew chapter 12. And beginning in verse 1, we'll read the first 7 verses of this. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." Well, they weren't like threshing and all of that. They were just picking grain and rubbing it and eating. That's all that they were doing. Verse 3, but he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent?" In other words, they're offering sacrifices. They're working on the Sabbath. So they're breaking the Sabbath because they're working. Well, they weren't really breaking the Sabbath because they had to offer sacrifices. "But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what it means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." Whew, he puts them in their place. When Jesus says to you, "Have you not read?" Kind of makes you feel a little ashamed, doesn't it? In other words, they should have known. They should have known. And if we don't know our Old Testaments, our Old Testament, not plural, there are so many things in the New Testament that just wouldn't make sense. But since we understand what David did and we know about that, then when we read this, it makes sense to us. Now, this is a hotly debated passage, and I just want to read what I think is an excellent explanation that Bob and Sandra Waldron provide in their book, our book, that we're studying for this class. It's on page 30. He said, Jesus refers to this story when the Pharisees criticized his disciples for plucking grain on the Sabbath day. The Jews did not criticize David for doing something that was expressly against God's law, and yet they criticized Jesus when his disciples had broken the rules the Jews themselves had made about the Sabbath. The Jews recognized it was an emergency when David was given the showbread. It would have been carrying God's law beyond the point God intended if Ahimelech had refused to help David in his time of need. It was carrying the Sabbath law further than God intended when the Pharisees said that the disciples could not meet their physical need by plucking grain to eat. I think that's just the simplest way to explain that. Any other thoughts or comments before we move to the next section? Jason?
I think it serves as a warning to us, though. I'm going to use the phrase selective prosecution. We apply God's law to people outside the church, sometimes with a heavy hand, and then let's say slide to people inside the church, or if it's somebody we like versus somebody we don't like. And that's kind of what the Jews did. They liked David. He was their hero. So we're going to let this slide. We're not going to talk about it, even if there is a good justification and explanation like the Waldrons put in here. But with Jesus, they didn't like him.
Right.
They didn't like his message.
Right.
So we're going to come down with a heavy hand and try to condemn him and his followers. And I think as we evaluate other people and try to help other people, that should be our mindset, helping, not condemning, and certainly not condemning inconsistently and with a heavy hand.
Yeah, it's, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says that love believes all things. He says love bears all things, right before he says love believes all things. And so we need to believe the best about one another and don't look to find fault. Assume that the person has the best intentions. Don't assume the worst. And so we certainly see the Pharisees have the opposite attitude than they need to. Chloe and then David, and then we'll move on.
So when David was given the showbread, why didn't they contact God ahead of time? Because you see a lot of the times David would pray to God if he needed guidance, or you see in the past that people pray to God if they have a question. So
yeah.
It is against the law, but I wonder if it would have been different if they had just contacted God. So it would have been easy to avoid.
Well, first of all, we don't know that they didn't ask God. They could have, but there's no indication that they did. But I don't think that they did something. I'm not convinced that they did something wrong in this case. I think that they, Ahimelech, Ahimelech had a choice between, do I remain legalistic in my thinking here, or do I do this right thing by helping David? And so I think there was kind of the choice between those two. And I think we look at that and we can understand in this case, it makes sense to help David with that. I could be wrong on that, but that's where I stand at this point in my understanding. All right, one more comment, David?
In Deuteronomy 23 and verse 25, let me read it to you. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. Right. So it was legal for them to do that.
Absolutely. It was legal, and even on the Sabbath. It's ridiculous to say that they were working, that they were sinning on the Sabbath. That's how legalistic the Pharisees had become. It was really sad. So, there is a lesson there about legalism. And we do want to observe God's law. We want to observe the details of God's law. But we don't want to kind of create our own rules and enforce that like it's the gospel. That would be pharisaical and sinful and wrong. All right, let's move to the next section. 1 Samuel 21, 10 through 15. David before King Achish. All right, so David fled to, now I made a big boo-boo earlier, because I said Abimelech was the king of Gath. It's Achish who is the king of Gath. It's Abimelech who we discover later in the story, right? We do have an Abimelech later in this story. Am I right? Or have I lost my mind? Can y'all help me out? Is there no Abimelech later in this story? So there's Abimelechs in other places, but not in this story. So, see, I do make mistakes, a lot. All right, well, maybe Keith can just edit that part out.
So, at the very top of page 29, the heading is David, it's Ahimelech.
Yeah. So there are Abimelechs in the Bible, but not in this story. So, for some reason I got Abimelech and Achish mixed up, and that just is very concerning. I'm not sure that happened. Yeah. So, anyway, moving on. So David fled to Achish, king of Gath. And you can see where Gath is located here on the map. Not too far away from where he was. And Achish then learned that David was who he was, that he was king, even though David wasn't yet actually king. He was anointed to be king, and he was a great warrior. And once David found out that Achish knew who he was very afraid. And so what was his plan to kind of get out of this?
Insanity.
Yeah, he pretended to be insane, and he just began drooling. It's just almost funny to imagine. He's just drooling all over his beard, and he's scribbling on the doors and just pretending to be this crazy person. And what does the king of Gath say?
Out with it.
Yeah. Get him out of here. Get him out of here. You know what? I think here's what happened. With Abraham, there was an Abimelech, king of Gerar, that Abraham lied to about his wife. And when I saw king of Gath, my brain instantly went to king of Gerar and somehow inserted Abimelech for Achish. That is crazy. So anyway, David escapes. Now, let's hold your place here and go to Psalm 56. Psalm 56. And again, notice I did not say Psalms 56 because the book of Psalms is not made up of chapters. It is made up of psalms, individual psalms. So the proper way to refer to a single psalm is Psalm. So we have Psalm 56. Now the headings of the psalms are not inspired, but they are regarded to be accurate. I wouldn't look at them as inspired, but I think that we could rely on these, and they do go way back. So in our Bibles, we have headings above our chapters in the Bible that, like the publisher of that Bible inserted there to help us. These headings were not inserted by the publishers of your Bible, but they are ancient. Okay, they are very old, and so this psalm includes the note. Well, I'll just read it. It says, "For the choir director, according to Jotham Elam Rekohim, a miktam of David when the Philistines seized him in Gath." Miktam possibly suggests atonement. We're going to see that word a lot in these headings. This is a psalm of trust, and you see that the context is this very story that we're talking about when he fled from, actually when he was seized by the king of Gath. Look at the first 4 verses. "Be gracious to me, O God, for man has trampled upon me. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me. My foes have trampled upon me all day long, for they are many who fight proudly against me. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me?" My verse has the word mere inserted there. What can mere man do to me? But when you see a word in italics, you know that it was added for emphasis. But it doesn't sound as good to say, "What can mere man do to me?" It's just, "What can man do to me?" And that's the way it says it in verse 11. "In God I have put my trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me?" What an uplifting passage. Especially when you put yourself in David's shoes. He's in the presence of the Philistines, and they've found out who he is. They could have had him killed easily. He was afraid, but he was trusting in the Lord. And we find ourselves in situations all the time that are scary, and we don't know what's going to happen. But what can man do to us? In God we put our trust. Look at verse 8. I love this verse. It's very poetic and beautiful. David prays, "You have taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" Again, being educated in the story that was happening informs our understanding of that verse. When he says wanderings, what specifically is he referring to? He's running from Saul. If we didn't understand that story, then that wouldn't have as much meaning to us. And when he says, put my tears in your bottle, are they not in your book? It's just a poetic way of saying, God is aware of all of my suffering. And we just need to remember that when we feel alone and we feel like nobody else cares, God's putting our tears in a bottle. He's recording all of our tears in His book. It's poetic, but He sees, He knows. So that's a beautiful song. All right, now let's go to Psalm 34. Psalm 34. Now look in the heading of this one. A psalm of David when he feigned madness before... Now that might be an additional reason why I'm confused. Before Abimelech, who drove him away and he departed. What is going on? I am just so confused right now. Okay, so I'm not sure why it says Abimelech and not Achish.
So apparently all three, he's known as all three. I just looked it up and I was confused. So.
Okay, I feel a little better now. Whew. Okay, so you say all three. So there's Achish, Abimelech, and what other?
Ahimelech.
No. Ahimelech was the priest.
Well, so according to multiple sources, it could also be.
No way! Terry, that was helpful, brother. All right, that was helpful. So I do feel better about my sanity now. But here, the interesting thing about this psalm is it's an alphabetical psalm. You don't see it in the English, but in the Hebrew, each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, starting with Aleph. So verse 1, the first word of verse 1 will start with the Hebrew word Aleph, a Hebrew letter, Aleph. Verse 2, the first word of that verse in the Hebrew starts with the Hebrew letter Bet, B-E-T-H, and then Gimel and Daleth and so on. 21 out of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are in this psalm. And if you were reading it in Hebrew and you knew Hebrew, you would immediately know and notice that. So it was just one of the structures. And that happens in some of the Psalms. There are a lot of structures that we don't recognize, and we just read the passage for what it says, but it's fascinating anyway. It was a very poetic thing. Sir? What's that?
Well, aren't all letters in there because it's 22 verses, right?
Well, I have a note that it's 21 letters out of 22, but you're right, there are 22 verses. 22 actually repeats the Hebrew letter that is spelled P-E. And so it ends in verse 21 with the Hebrew letter T-A-W. And one of the interesting things is, like, sometimes there will be an emphasis these letters actually had a meaning too. Like, for example, in verse 15, the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. So that starts with the Hebrew letter that is A-Y-I-N, and that word in the Hebrew means eye. And it says the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. So there's all these little intricate details that we don't catch in the English. But I don't read Hebrew, so I just researched this one in a class that I taught on Psalms one time. So, now let's look at a couple of things. Look at verse 4. I sought the Lord, and He answered me and delivered me from all my fears. See how that's just kind of a natural follow-up on that other psalm we were just looking at where he was afraid? Here he's saying, you delivered me from my fears. He's not saying you will deliver me. He's saying you did deliver me. And we need to do that. We need to say that to God. You delivered me. Not just like think, oh, that was nice that He delivered me. Moving on. Stop and tell God, thank you. I praise you because you did deliver me. Look at verse 8. Beautiful. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in Him. See, David has been delivered, and he is recommending the Lord to others so that they might experience that deliverance. You know what we call that? Evangelism. Just recommending the Lord to others. Isn't it natural to recommend things that you like? Somebody have to pay you to do that? To recommend products you like? No. Hey, if we love the Lord, what should we do naturally? Recommend Him to others. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. We get all intimidated by, well, we have to tell them all the things we don't do in our church. And no, forget, don't worry about that. You can get to that. What we need to do is just recommend the Lord to others and how wonderful He is. Let that be our starting point. Verses 15 and 16 now. I've already read verse 15. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. This is one passage out of many in the Old Testament that emphasize God does not hear the prayers of sinners. So that in John 9, when when the disciples say that to Jesus. We know that God doesn't hear sinners. Well, that's when the man who was healed of blindness, he said that to the Jews, to the Pharisees. We know that God doesn't hear sinners. That was established on Old Testament passages like this one. God hears the prayers of His righteous. That's a very general rule, you understand. We also have to consider Cornelius and things like that. All right? But I won't go into that. But see, in this context, he's saying, God heard me and delivered me. Why? Because I was righteous. Because I was righteous. Because I was serving Him. That's the point he's making. The righteous cry, verse 17, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Just beautiful. And then we have verses 19 and 20 that we've talked about in the talk earlier. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. And we saw how that ultimately is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and how His side was pierced and His bones were not broken like the other crucified victims. Now, stay in Psalms. I'm going to return to our story for a second, but stay here because we're going to just look at another psalm in a second. But first, does anybody have anything you need to share or ask at this point? Jason?
A quick thing, you brought it up briefly, but it's the please and thank you. We teach our children in society, growing up, you say please when you're asking for something, you say thank you when you get it. And we just need to apply that to ourselves in our relationship with God. It's please and thank you. And I've noticed over the past several years, the men who lead prayers in this congregation are often thanking God for, we've been praying for this sick person and they've come through. We thank you for that. But that's as simple as it gets. It's please and thank you. And like you said, if you have to say enough thank yous to God, you should be reckoning to others. You know why? Because every time you go to Him and ask, He's there. But again, I just thought the simple mentality of please and thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know about y'all, but I'm a lot better at asking for things than thanking God for things He's already done. I mean, it's just a natural thing. We go to God and we start praying about this and that and the other, and God help me with this and help this person with that, and we don't stop to think of specific things. That's the thing. David didn't just say, thank you, God, for answering my prayers in general. He's praising God for deliverance, and we know specifically what deliverance He had in mind in that specific instance. And so we need to, and I'm preaching to myself because I need to do better on this, is we need to praise God for the specific answers to our prayers that He has given us. But of course, we can't do that if we're not praying in the first place, can we? For things to happen. All right? Phil?
I think David in this passage here demonstrates two important principles in our walk with God. Number one, that putting your faith and trust in God doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a real place with fear and trembling. He understood the gravity of his physical situation, his earthly situation.
Sure.
But his soul trusted in God, that even if God didn't deliver him from this physically, he knew his soul was kept by God.
Amen.
And faith cannot grow outside of that fear and trembling that we have of those around us. That's where it grows. We want to grow it in a vacuum, away from all of that. And it doesn't happen that way.
Do not fear him who can destroy the body, but him who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. Absolutely. That's a tremendous point. Very good. Okay, any other thoughts? All right, so back to our story in the first 5 verses of 1 Samuel 22. And just like I said, stay here in Psalms. We have David in the cave of Adullam. Now, you see on the map where Adullam is located. And so he fled from Achish, or Abimelech. And I'm never going to forget that now. I got that. I hope y'all won't either. Fled over here east to Adullam, and I got some pictures of that cave. So this is the cave. This is the mouth, one of the entrances to the cave. And this is inside the cave. This is the very place where David was in the story we're talking about right now. This very cave. He and his men. That would have been looking out of the cave. You think David might have felt like he was in a cage? Like he was kind of, I'm fleeing and I'm in a cave. Well, he did feel that way because we know how he felt. That's the beauty of the Psalms here. We can see how David felt in Psalm 142. Now let's look there in Psalm 142. Now, this has as its title, Maskil of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. Now, this isn't the only time he was in a cave, so we don't know for sure if it's talking about the cave of Adullam. It could apply to another situation too, but we're going to read it as if it were in this context, and I think it's likely. Let me stop and say, so his family had come, found out he was there, his parents had come, kind of the riffraff of society had come, people that were discontented and in debt and so forth and so on, and they come to him, and how many men does he have that he's leading? 400. He's kind of their captain, all right? And so, but they're hiding out in this cave. And look in verses 3 and 4 of this psalm. By the way, this psalm is a desperate cry for deliverance. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, you knew my path. In the way where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. For there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. Now that would apply later when he's in a cave and Saul is actually there, like hunting him. But it would apply here too. David feels like nobody cares. Now, was that absolutely true? How many men did he have? Did they care? Let's hope so. But David felt nobody cares. And that feeling is reality to us. The truth is, somebody cares about your situation. But do you ever feel nobody cares? Nobody understands, nobody cares, I'm all alone. Do y'all feel that way? I feel that way sometimes. David felt that way. He says it here. Nobody cares. And he's just telling God, if you feel like nobody cares, tell God. This is how I feel, Lord. Nobody cares for me. We need to be honest with God. He already knows that you feel that way. So you're not hiding it from Him to not tell Him. He wants you to pour your heart out. How do you think Jesus prayed all night long? He was pouring His heart out to God. Absolutely. In verse 7 of this psalm, bring my soul out of prison, so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. I said earlier, do you think David felt like he was in prison? Maybe that's what he's thinking of when he says, bring me out of prison. I'm fleeing and I'm in a cave. It's like I'm in prison. Deliver me. But he trusts in God to do it. And he's already planning to give thanks to God once he's delivered. In faith, we need to think ahead and think of where, not where we are, but God, you're going to deliver me, and I'm going to think about that. I'm going to put my mind there, and I will praise you once this is over. Isn't that beautiful? It's just David's faith is just so amazing. So amazing. So they all went to Mizpah of Moab. Now, I don't know where Mizpah of Moab was. There's another Mizpah in the land of Israel. I know where it is, but I don't know where Mizpah is in Moab. But we know where Moab is here on the east side of the Dead Sea, between the Arnon and Zered rivers. You guys know where that is. So he's somewhere in that area at a stronghold in this city called Mizpah. And he has his parents with him, and he's bringing his parents there specifically to do what?
Probably save Saul.
Yeah, to leave them there. I mean, his parents are getting old. His father was described as being old at the time of the story of David and Goliath. And so he's older now, and he can't take all this fleeing to caves and everything, so he brings them to Moab. Why would David think, and why would it be safe to bring his parents to Moab? He descended from Ruth. the Moabitess. So I think that's the best explanation for that. There was a prophet by the name of Gad that told David to depart from Moab and go back to Judah. So he flees from there and he goes to the forests of Hereth that is very close to that cave where he was in Adullam. And then we come to our next section of the story. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Comments? Brenda?
I was just going to comment, being in a cave, that picture was nice and brightly lit and dry and, just, it wasn't that way when he was in it.
Right, true.
And I would feel like an animal or feel trapped or something if I had to, for my own safety, crawl in a hole in the ground.
Crawl in a hole in the ground,
That's a very pathetic image, and I can see why he would still feel alone, even though he had people there with him. That's a mental feeling.
Absolutely. And even if we don't literally crawl in a hole, sometimes we feel like we are in one. And we need to tell God, I feel like I'm in prison here. I need deliverance. Phil?
I love David because, in the profile that's given here, because on one hand he's seen as this great warrior who can defeat all of his enemies. And in the next breath he's afraid of all of his enemies.
Right.
He's experienced both. But there was a quote in Acts 2 that in the sermon that Peter preached in Pentecost, and he talks about David's real underlying trust and power and how he got through that hard time. Let me read this for just a minute. I think this really typifies David in the presence of the fear and the anxiety and everything he's going through. He says, for I saw the Lord always in my presence, for he is at my right hand so that I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue exalted. Moreover, my flesh also will live in hope, because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay. For you have made known to me the ways of life, and you will make me full of gladness with your presence.
Beautiful.
There's his success. There's what it's about. Right?
Absolutely.
If you have Jesus, you got it all. Right.
Yeah. That quotation from Psalm 16, I believe it was. Very good. Okay, one more comment?
Just that I'm just certain this is not what you would have in mind. And he's thinking, whoa, this isn't quite what I thought it was.
Right. He was better off just as a shepherd out there quiet in the field, wasn't he? Yeah.
Right, and where he knew that he was God's chosen one, and there's a certain comfort that comes with that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for me, there would be a certain doubt that would come with, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Am I still your chosen one?
Yeah.
Did I mess up something with that?
Yeah.
What, and there's a lot of doubt that can come with that.
Sure.
For me, and so,
Right.
the way that he sees all of these things, the way that he writes about these things.
Yeah.
It's
I know.
nice to have that.
David might be thinking, what have I gotten myself into? You know, you don't know where the path is going to lead. When you put on the name of Jesus Christ, it's not all just going to be, I don't know, what do they say, flowers and something beautiful? Yeah. Was it flowers and rainbows? Is that what it is? Well, something like that. It's not all just going to be just nice and easy. It's not going to be easy street. We don't know where the path is going to lead. It might be very, very difficult. But that's the commitment. Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 14. The kind of sacrifices that we have to be willing to make when we've said we are a disciple means we're willing to endure all of this difficulty. And if we're not, then Jesus says you're not a disciple of mine. So I think we can have some application there. Thanks for your comment. Okay, very good. Yes, sir. Tim?
What you just said, that we don't know where this path's going to lead. That's the difficulty. It's really a lie in a way. Jesus certainly speaks of it, but we do know that we forget when we see the distractions of this life and the curses that come our way. But on the other hand, we are absolutely sure where this path leads. It's supposed to be where we should be.
Right.
We should have that confidence. I think this is all that they had in that first century. There's something about knowing you're next in line into the arena to be eaten by a lion.
Right.
We don't know that. We don't know suffering like that.
Right, and you're right. Yeah, there was a sense in which, as Paul told Timothy, basically those who put on the name of Christ will suffer persecution. Yeah, that's not the exact words, but that's the idea. So good point. All right, now in verses 6 through 19, this is very, very sad. Saul was in Gibeah, which was his hometown, his capital, and he was under a tamarisk tree. Now, I wish I could tell you that's the tamarisk tree, but this tamarisk tree's not as old as the one Saul was under, if that tree had lived to this point, which I'm sure it hasn't. But this is what a tamarisk tree looks like. And what does he have with him? He's got his spear. Now, he is a maniac by this point. He's paranoid, and he's just ready to murder. And he's got this spear with him everywhere. Keep your eye on that spear. He's already tried to kill David and his own son Jonathan with that spear, and he's just always going to have this sorry spear with him everywhere he goes. Doesn't do him a lick of good, but he's got it with him. And look in verses 7 and 8. We're in 1 Samuel 22, and verses 7 and 8. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds?" These are Benjamites. What tribe was Saul of? Benjamin. What tribe was David of? Judah. If David becomes king, he's not going to show favor to you Benjamites. You see again how understanding these things informs our interpretation here and enriches our understanding. Verse 8, "For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is none of you who is sorry for me, or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day." Oh, please. Now, first of all, he's living in an alternate universe. He's telling himself lies, and I think he believes these lies. Some of what he says may be true. Maybe some of them weren't disclosing some of the things that happened. Maybe because they realized he was a maniac. But is David lying in ambush to wait and kill him? No. I mean, the total opposite is he's the one that's hunting down David. But he's telling himself this story. Even crazy people, and I think we could almost put Saul in that category, even people who do very irrational things, they have reasons that in their mind are very rational. Even people who go and do these school shootings, Brian's going to talk about that, they have things in their mind, these lies they're telling themselves that to them justify what they're doing. That's just how humans are. We have to have some reason that justifies what we're doing. And so Saul is justifying all of this by, well, David's just trying to kill me. But that wasn't the case at all. Well, there was one there who knew what Ahimelech, the priest, had done in helping David. And what was his name again? All right, I call him Doeg, and he was the Edomite. He wasn't an Israelite. He didn't necessarily have any real commitment to these people or to God. He didn't have any commitment to these people or to God. He had a commitment to Saul, and he wanted to be prominent in Saul's kingdom. So Doeg is just thinking totally selfishly and is willing to do anything that he needs to. So Saul has Ahimelech and all the other priests of Nob brought because they had helped David. He asked Ahimelech why he had helped David so that David could lie in wait to ambush him. So the story he's telling himself now is Ahimelech helped David specifically so that David could kill me. But think about Ahimelech for a minute. Poor Ahimelech, all he knew is David shows up and says, "King Saul has sent me, help me." And he helps him. In helping David, who ultimately does Ahimelech think he's helping? Saul. He did this to try to help Saul. But of course, Saul's not going to believe anything Ahimelech has to say as Ahimelech defends himself. Ahimelech says, "Don't impute this to me." You know, Jesus said, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." Don't impute things on people that you don't know for a fact. Examine the facts. Innocent till proven guilty, right? And so Saul commands Ahimelech to murder these 85 priests. First, he orders his guards to do it. They were unwilling, but Doeg, the Edomite, was willing to do it. And he kills all of them. He goes then to Nob and kills all the men, women, and children, and animals. The very kind of destruction God wanted Saul to exact upon the Amalekites. And Saul was unwilling to do that to those wicked people. But now this righteous city is just slaughtered. And it's just so sad. Well, I didn't get through all my material, y'all, but we'll pick up there in verse 20 on Wednesday night. Just read through what the syllabus says, because I don't want to keep clicking. All right. Thanks, everybody.